Hello and welcome back to our guide to etiquette. We are now in the second part of our conversational etiquette discussion. And in this second video, we will be focusing primarily on what not to say in conversations. So the first thing to talk about here in relation to what we should not be saying when we are in public conversation, whether it's some kind of party that we're at or some other type of event where we're intermingling with various people who may not just be a circle of our closest friends. When we're in that kind of context, you really want to try to avoid arguments. The last thing you want is for people to first meet you in a context where they see you arguing with somebody else. Even if it is a kind of friendly debate that you have with a friend of yours, if someone else is watching that, it doesn't know you or anything about you, if that is their first impression of you, it is not going to leave a positive idea about who you are in the mind of the other person. So there are appropriate circumstances in which it is okay to have an argument. And there are circumstances in which it is not appropriate to have an argument. And I guess it depends on what you mean really by argument, but I'm thinking primarily of a kind of heated debate. You have an idea about, say, politics that differs from somebody else's idea about politics, and there is a very healthy place for people to be able to get together and do those things. Whether it's a formal debate setting or you just have close friends that you're okay disagreeing with, and you can hash those ideas out together. You don't want to be doing that in a room full of people that don't know either of you, or it's not going to look good for either of you. So if you have a close circle of friends, you kind of know those situations where you have those friendships where you're able to do that kind of thing. And so in a small circle of individuals, yeah, of course, those kinds of things are okay. Those kind of things can be very healthy. It can be very beneficial for the sharpening of your own intellect to have somebody to spar with about various ideas that don't happen to agree with you. But don't do it at a dinner party. Don't do it with a large group of people there, unless you're on a debate stage doing some kind of public debate. Related to that, etiquette dictates that you should try to avoid controversial or hot-button topics when you are in a public place and just meeting people for the first time. Now, some of that may differ depending on the kind of event that you are attending. And I know often people say things like, don't talk about religion or politics in public or polite conversation because those are things that people tend to disagree on and debate on. Well, if I happen to be at an event where I am with a bunch of other theologians that I study theology, and religion and theology is my field, of course that is a topic that would be fine to discuss, in that particular context, but you have to know the context. If I was, attending some kind of public event that was sponsored by a particular political party where I know people are there because they agree with me on this or that issue, then of course those kinds of things would make sense. But generally, when you're just meeting people, when, say, it is a dinner party, it's a party that you're invited to with people you don't know that may have very different views on all sorts of things, it is not polite or proper to bring up things that you know are going to be controversial. What that doesn't mean is that you hide what you think about things. I'm not encouraging you to lie about what your thoughts on something might be, but generally avoid bringing those kinds of issues up if you can help it. And if somebody does ask you your opinion on those issues, you certainly are free to share those opinions, but do so in a way that is polite, in a way that you are not speaking abrasively toward the other person on those issues. Something else related to this that is very important is don't assume that other people that you meet agree with your ideas. And I've experienced this in my own life socially, and I'm sure others have as well, where you start a conversation with somebody that you don't really know, and they start talking at you and speaking really more, as I said, at you than to you, about whether it is a political issue or an ethical issue or some other kind of very heated topic of discussion in our culture right now. And they speak as if you agree with them when you don't agree with them because you don't even know who this person is, and they just are coming at you with the assumption that, Well, any intelligent person would have the same view that I have on this. And that is extremely off-putting. And when somebody does that, it puts you in a very uncomfortable position because you kind of feel like you have to just nod your head, and they have already set the groundwork to say, kind of, I know that this is true, and it's so obviously true that I'm not even going to speak to you as if you could possibly have a different opinion, that it's very uncomfortable then to say anything because they're not inviting an actual conversation with divergent views, but you also don't want to pretend you agree. In those kinds of circumstances, I just tend to try to get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. And there are ways to do that and be polite in doing that. But try to maybe change the topic or bring something else up that perhaps sounds as if it's kind of related, but just moves the topic toward something else. So don't be the person who does that. Don't just assume that because somebody is there, or because you happen to think that something is obvious and true, that everyone around you will agree with you. And if you really want to convince other people that you are correct, you're certainly not going to do it by having an attitude like that. It really is a turnoff, both probably to your ideas and to you as a person or a friend that someone will actually want to spend time getting to know. Something else not to do in public is to fight back if somebody is trying to start an argument. And if you are in a setting, say you're at a family reunion and you have all of this extended family that you have never met before, you're meeting them for the first time, and maybe somebody knows something about you they don't like, whether it's an idea you have or the religion you are or whatever else it might be. They don't agree with something in your life or your lifestyle, and they try to start an argument with you. You don't really know this person. The proper thing to do in that circumstance is not to argue back. The proper thing to do in that circumstance is to simply walk away. You can be blunt and just say, I don't think this is an appropriate place to have this kind of conversation. So if somebody is trying to argue with you or insult you, and you do take the high road in simply not responding or not responding in kind, that is going to garner the respect of other people. If you do not engage in those kinds of back and forth insults, it's actually going to speak more highly of you as a person to the other people there. And you are going to make the other person look far worse in their insulting of you than you would have done had you responded in kind. I want to say something about the grammar and vocabulary that you are using when you're in a social context that is more public, or one that you don't know everybody intimately like a close group of friends. It is important to try to use proper grammar as much as you possibly can. It communicates clearly, it communicates well. It gives other people a positive impression of you and who you are. It does make you appear to be well-educated and thoughtful in the things that you say. And then there's the issue of vocabulary, because proper grammar is one thing, and then choosing certain words or deciding which words you're going to choose to communicate your ideas is really another question, though very much related. There are some people in social situations, particularly those who perhaps are in more academic fields, that try to use complicated vocabulary when they are just in any social gathering. And I think the reason that they do that, well, there are probably two different reasons why people tend to do that. One of those is simply that is the way that they think about things in their everyday life, because they are working within academia, they're thinking about academia, and they are writing articles, and that's the kind of vocabulary that they use with their own writing and their own teaching to students, and it may be the vocabulary that they use when they're in conversation with other faculty members at a university. However, it does not mean that there are not improper contexts in which that kind of vocabulary should be used. So if you enter into a situation where people are not educated in the field in which you are, or perhaps you're with people that don't really have a higher education at all, and to be clear, I don't think it's the case that a formal education alone gives you a large vocabulary. There are plenty of people I know who don't have any, college level education at all that probably have a more significant vocabulary than people I know with PhDs, because of the amount of reading that they have done and just the culture of their family and the culture of the community where they live. But if you have that vocabulary that is a kind of higher vocabulary, it is not polite to use all of those complicated terms in a context where other people don't know the language that you are using, because it comes across as if you are just trying to show off. You know more than those people do. And when you speak with a vocabulary that is not understood by the people that you are talking to, they feel embarrassed and they feel excluded because they don't understand what you're talking about. And then they are in that very awkward position of having to kind of smile and nod and pretend they know what you're saying, but they really don't. So know who the people are, listen to how they talk, know what their general culture or vocations are, and don't just assume, say, because you have a PhD in analytic philosophy from Oxford, that you can use the language that you would use in your philosophical papers in any context whatsoever, and don't assume that, well, other people should just try to figure out what I'm saying. Instead, you need to be outward focused, as we've spoken about with etiquette. It is not about the self, but it's about making other people feel comfortable and demonstrating respect and care for the people around you. And so that leads then to the second reason why people might use very complicated vocabulary within a social situation, and that is that that person is rather insecure and feels like they are going to garner more respect from people by using certain kinds of vocabulary. And this is a way to show status, to show off, to say, look, I'm important because I know large words. And if you are doing that, it does come across as rather inauthentic, and people generally are not going to fall for it. It usually is very clear when somebody speaks that way naturally because, say, they are in an academic field and that's the kind of language that they use. And when somebody is very purposefully putting on a kind of affectation in order to sound like they are intelligent. So just be yourself in the way that you speak. That's really more important than trying to use complicated vocabulary. And if you try really hard to use complicated vocabulary in certain scenarios, there's also the very likely chance that you're going to use a word wrong and it is just going to backfire, and then you will look far less impressive and intelligent than if you just didn't try to do that in the first place. And then one other thing to bring up, and that's related to that with the way that you speak and the way that you communicate with others, don't use foreign languages excessively in your speech where that is not appropriate. I do see this, for example, with people in the field of theology, where they learn a significant amount of Greek as they are learning to study the Greek New Testament, and that if people ask them questions related to their field, which is the study of theology, they cite Greek terms and then define them repeatedly. Or people do this with Latin as well. And that's just one example of a field where people do that. And this is done in social contexts pretty much exclusively to try to impress others, to try to say, I know something important, and I know a lot. Here, I know Greek. And of course, the other person, if they do not know Greek, it may seem impressive to them. Of course, if you happen to try to do something like this and it's a language where you have native speakers and you happen to maybe run into one by accident, then things get a bit embarrassing, as you probably don't know it as well as it may appear from somebody who doesn't know the language. But generally, don't just throw around foreign words or phrases or terms for absolutely no reason. It does come across as rather standoffish. People see it as an attempt for you to be arrogant. And as much as you may think you sound impressive, nobody else is going to think that. And then I just want to talk about a few things not to say when you're in polite conversation. The first of these is a rule that hopefully you know, and that is, do not ask a woman if she is pregnant. Most of the time, you probably are able to tell accurately whether that person, is carrying a child. However, there are those small amounts of circumstances in which a woman may simply look pregnant because of the shape of her stomach. And to ask a woman if she is pregnant when she is not is about the most humiliating and embarrassing social scenario you could possibly engage in. And it should just generally be the case that things, whether it is pregnancy or anything else about somebody's life, things like that shouldn't really be assumed by you in the sense that both you assume what their life is like, but also you assume that they want to talk about that. You can even kind of ask around certain things, trying not to make it too obvious if there is something you're kind of wanting to know. So there are ways to do it in a subtle, appropriate way without asking directly. And then if they still, you kind of try to maybe feel your way around something and they still just don't share that information, then don't worry about it and don't try to pry. So always leave answers to those kinds of questions up to the person themselves as to whether they want to answer those things. So don't ask a woman if she is pregnant. You don't want to get into the awkward scenario of her having to say, no, I am not. And then you have to deal with both her social humiliation at what you've done, but also your own social humiliation. And second, you've probably heard this many times as well, related to this, but still, I hear this happening a lot. And that is, do not ask someone's age. Don't ask someone's age. Many people are insecure about their age. That doesn't mean everybody is. Some people are very happy to share their age with you. There are people who are very insecure about aging, and they just don't want to talk about it. So it's not a polite thing generally to ask. Now, there are ways to kind of gauge this or ask questions about certain things if you really want to know. The question, of course, then is, well, why would you really want to know? The one time when it may be relevant is you think that somebody perhaps is your age and you kind of want to know because you have a topic of conversation that may be related to something that's, happened at a certain age, or something that you had watched or was popular at a certain age that you think you can relate to the other person on. So when it comes to that type of thing, it usually is better to ask more general questions. That's really the only time in which I think there is any appropriate way even to try to, and even in a roundabout way, try to figure out somebody's age. Now, as you get to know somebody better, and you get to become friends with somebody and you don't know their age, it's not inappropriate at some point to ask. But you certainly don't do that in a public situation, and you certainly don't do it when you first meet someone. Third thing that you don't want to bring up in conversation is you don't want to ask somebody's salary. Again, it is inappropriate to do that. There are people who have a lower salary who simply may be kind of embarrassed to share their salary, especially if you're at an event where maybe people generally make more than that individual. And on the other hand, you may have someone that has a very high salary, and you know what high salary people really don't like to be asked about? That is how much money they make. So there is a certain group of people that really loves to talk about how much money they make. And that is people that have just come into some amount of money. Those who are well established financially don't like to show off their money. They don't want to talk about their money. They, in fact, would rather talk about anything besides their money. And the only people that they want to talk about those things with are those who are close to them, whether it's family or even others who are in the same income level that they are in, that they have a closer relationship with. But you have no right to that kind of information from those people. And so you have the situation where somebody doesn't have a lot of money and you could embarrass them. Then you have the situation where somebody makes a lot of money and they don't want to talk about it, and it is just not going to give you any social capital to talk about it. And then you have the worst case scenario, which is you ask somebody who would love to tell you about the money they make, and that makes a terrible conversation. So you don't want to do that either. Usually if someone wants to ask about the earnings of somebody else, they are doing it because they want to brag about themselves and how much they make. That's usually the only context in which that kind of thing would be the case. I do, however, remember when my kids were younger that we were just having conversations about finances, and I talked to my kids about finances, and I did this when they were very young. And the reason is I just think it's important for children to understand money and generally how it works, because I think it's important for people to feel like they have some idea about finances and saving by the time they leave the house. It's one of those things that I think just should in a family be part of conversations, not extensively. You don't have to tell your kids how much money you make all the time in every way, but to at least be somewhat open about those things because it helps to prepare them. So we were having these conversations at the time, and I remember inviting people over at one point, and I didn't have this conversation yet with my son about how it was inappropriate. He just started asking everybody, "How much money do you make?" I had to take him aside, and we had that conversation. Now nobody was offended because he was a little child, and they all thought it was funny. But you don't want to do that seriously, and don't talk about your own salary either, because again, either if you brag about your salary and you make a lot of money, you are going to do one of two things. You are going to speak to somebody that has a higher salary, and then you're going to embarrass yourself because you realize it's not impressive to them, or you are going to just embarrass somebody else by talking about how you make more than them. And as we keep talking about, etiquette is not based on the self, etiquette is based on others. And so if it's something that is merely for the benefit socially of the self, then it is not proper etiquette. That's a general rule. And related to salary, but not exactly the same, and this is not nearly as rude as the other, is asking about somebody's job. And it does tend to be the case that when people get together, adults get together, it's like when you get together because I work with college students, when you get together with college students, everybody asks you, what's your major? Because that tells you something about the person. But later in life, when you meet somebody, it's very common to ask, what is your job? And this has become a lot more, I think, socially acceptable than it used to be. At least when you read etiquette manuals, even contemporary ones as well, they do tell you not to do this. And this one may seem a little odd for people because asking about somebody's job does tend to be a kind of easy question to say, I don't know what else to say, and I want to know something about you, and, well, you must spend a lot of time. Everybody spends a lot of time with whatever they're doing at work, so that at least gives me some idea of who you are. But there are a couple reasons why it tends to be a topic that is to be avoided when you're asking people questions. The first of those is they may not have a job, right? They may be out of a job. It may be the case that you are asking somebody what their job is, and there is this kind of social stigma perhaps around their job. There are certain vocations that people have that they may feel a stigma about. They may be kind of embarrassed that, I'm at this party with, a bunch of lawyers, and, I just kind of work a lower level desk job, or I'm a plumber, or whatever you may be. Now, there's nothing lesser about any of those jobs, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But within a certain social context, that person could feel uncomfortable about it, and they could feel this kind of pressure of like, I don't fit in, or I'm not making as much as this person, or they may look down on me. Even if you're not doing that at all, and you may not be, you don't want to give that kind of impression. So you can have all sorts of other conversations in which, if that person does want to share that, they will share that. And it's very likely that in the midst of a conversation, work just kind of comes up. So the other reason, though, the second reason why it is generally frowned upon to ask about a job is that it kind of assumes that somebody's work is the most important thing about them. And I think especially this is true about Americans. We do have a high emphasis on income level. We have a high emphasis on what you do for work. And in some ways, people's social values are determined by those things. Am I saying that should be the case? No. But like it or not, it is the case in many ways. There are contexts in which people do, think about people in that way. And the reality is, a job is part of your life, but it's not the most important part of your life. And so it often brings about a much better conversation if you ask somebody about them as a person that is not just the question of their job. Ask questions about, their interests. What do they like to do in their free time? Those kinds of questions often lead to a more passionate discussion of, these are the things I really care about. Because a lot of people, and there are people that are passionate about their jobs, but there are plenty of people that work a job that they don't like that much, and their real passion is something else. And so by asking those other kinds of questions, you can really more get to the heart of where somebody is and what they love, what they enjoy, and who they are as a person. And then related to work, if the party that you're at or the group of people that you're with is one that includes maybe entirely people from work or largely people from work, don't talk about work. You have plenty of time within your regular job seeing those people, or whether maybe it's remote work and you're talking on Slack or whatever it might be. You have plenty of time that you have talked to those people about work. And when you're discussing work, when you're with those people, which is kind of a go-to subject because you connect that person with work, you're still stuck in that work mindset, and you're never going to actually be able to relax and enjoy your time with those people. Get to know them as they are as human beings, apart from just what you do at a job. So try not to talk about work when you are out with work friends doing something else. Just don't mention if someone gained weight or looks older. It is extremely rude, and I know a lot of people who do this, and often do it in very backhanded ways without saying it so directly, that they will hint at their weight in a way that perhaps sounds slightly nicer, but just letting you know, I'd noticed, by the way, that you've gained weight. Don't do that. There is no reason to have backhanded compliments or comments anyway. But whether it's straightforward or backhanded, there is no reason to talk about somebody looking older or gaining weight. Whatever you may happen to think about that, it is none of your business, so don't talk about it. So I hope you found this helpful in this continued series as we are talking about etiquette. It's been a very long time since I've done these, and I have a whole list, and I do have other things I want to get to. So someone just messaged me about this the other day, and I said I really should get back to that. So make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.